The morning sunlight filtered through the bedroom window of Margaret Chen's modest Santa Monica bungalow, painting golden rectangles across her weathered hardwood floor. She lay in bed for several moments, as she did every morning, taking inventory of her body like a general surveying a battlefield. The left knee, stiff but manageable. The right shoulder, sharp pain radiating down to her elbow when she attempted certain movements. Her hands, once steady and sure as they'd been for 3 decades as a registered nurse, now bore the gnarled knuckles of advanced rheumatoid arthritis. Margaret flexed her fingers slowly, methodically, part of the physical therapy routine that had become as essential as breathing. At 58 years old, Margaret Chen had learned to negotiate with her own body in ways younger people could never understand. 30 years of 12-hour shifts in hospital wards, lifting patients, running between rooms, standing for hours at a time, had taken their toll. The cumulative weight of a lifetime of selfless service was now exacting its price, payment due in daily discomfort and the gradual loss of independence that had once defined her. She sat up slowly, gripping the bed frame with both hands, and waited for the initial dizziness to pass. The small white pills in their compartmentalized organizer on the nightstand awaited her: methotrexate, prednisone, naproxen, and 2 supplements that her rheumatologist swore made a difference. Margaret swallowed them with room-temperature water, a ritual performed before she'd fully awakened. The pills would take 30 minutes to an hour to work their modest magic, reducing inflammation just enough to make the day tolerable. The apartment was quiet, peacefully, sometimes painfully quiet. Robert had been gone for 5 years now. Heart attack, sudden and complete, like a light switch turned off. One moment they were discussing retirement plans while sitting on the patio, watching the California sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The next moment, her husband of 32 years was gone, and Margaret became a widow. The 5 years since hadn't made the silence any easier to bear. She still made coffee for 2 on Sunday mornings, only realizing her mistake halfway through the ritual. Margaret showered carefully, using the shower chair and grab bars that Robert had installed before his death, with surprising intuition, as if he'd somehow known she would need them. The warm water cascaded over her shoulders, temporarily soothing her aching joints. She took her time, knowing that rushing would only lead to pain that lasted for hours. At her age, wisdom meant accepting that there was no longer any benefit to hurrying. By the time she was dressed, carefully selected clothes designed for ease of movement rather than fashion, it was nearly 11 in the morning. Margaret stood before her bedroom mirror and took a moment to really look at herself. The woman reflecting back was not the vibrant nurse who had once charmed frightened patients and commanded respect from younger staff members. Her face carried the map of every year she'd lived. Her hair had grayed to a silver color she'd eventually stopped trying to dye, and her eyes, once bright with purpose, had taken on the measured gaze of someone who'd seen suffering and learned to accept it. But her eyes still held kindness. That, she thought, was something the arthritis hadn't stolen. Margaret had decided weeks ago that today would be the day she purchased a birthday gift for her granddaughter, Lily. The child was turning 7 on Saturday, and Margaret had promised to find something special, something that would make Lily's eyes light up in that way that made Margaret feel like she still had something valuable to offer the world. Lily was the bridge that connected Margaret to her son, David, and his wife, Sarah. The relationship had been strained since Robert's death. Her son had suggested, with the gentleness he could muster, that perhaps she should get more involved and not isolate herself, as if Margaret could prevent the world from slowly closing her out. The walker stood by the bedroom door, aluminum and utilitarian, neither particularly attractive nor particularly welcome. Margaret had resisted it for 3 years before accepting the inevitable truth. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. The walker didn't define her, she'd finally concluded. It simply enabled her to move through a world that had never been designed with people like her in mind. The drive to Crescent Heights took 15 minutes, a route Margaret had traveled hundreds of times before her world had contracted. The shopping complex was the kind of place where wealthy people browsed without concern for price tags, where everything gleamed with the polish of aggressive cleanliness and nouveau rich pretension. Margaret had no particular interest in fashion or designer goods. She came here because the complex had excellent accessibility features, and more importantly, because a boutique called Wonderland Toys occupied a corner space with large doors and minimal steps. She found a parking spot relatively close to the entrance, one of the benefits of arriving in late morning when most of the serious shoppers had already come and gone. Margaret moved from car to walker with the careful precision of long practice, checking that her purse was secure and her phone charged. These small precautions had become automatic, part of the invisible calculations that guided her movements. The marble corridors of Crescent Heights stretched before her, a gleaming testament to wealth and aesthetic perfection. The air conditioning was almost aggressively cold, designed for people who moved quickly and expected comfort on their terms. Margaret moved slowly through the polished space, her walker clicking softly against the stone floor. She was aware of people flowing around her like water around a stone in a stream, but she'd learned not to take it personally. Everyone was busy. Everyone had somewhere more important to be. The elderly disabled woman shuffling through the mall had simply become part of the background scenery, invisible, forgettable, and utterly unremarkable. Margaret passed a small cafe where beautiful people sat nursing expensive coffees, and she continued on toward Wonderland Toys, her mind already imagining Lily's face when she opened her gift. She thought about the books she wanted to look at in the toy store, the games that might delight a 7-year-old with her granddaughter's bright, curious mind. She was thinking about joy, a thing so simple and pure that the world seemed determined to deny it to people like her. The afternoon sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the complex, warming the marble and illuminating countless dust particles floating in the air. Margaret Chen moved slowly through this temple of consumption, a woman invisible to the world, with no idea that her ordinary Tuesday was about to become a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone whose path she would cross. She had no idea that her moment was coming. Charles Whitmore checked his Rolex for the third time in as many minutes, the gesture an unconscious habit born from decades of believing that his time was more valuable than anyone else's. The watch had cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payment, a fact he never failed to appreciate. His perfectly tailored Italian suit, purchased during a spring trip to Milan, hung impeccably on his 6-foot frame. At 62, Charles maintained the physique of a man who'd never doubted his right to have whatever he wanted, including perfect health and eternal youth. "This is absolutely unacceptable," he muttered through clenched teeth, his jaw working with barely contained fury. His wife Victoria emerged from the restaurant's ladies' room, her designer handbag, a limited edition Hermes Kelly in crocodile leather, hanging from her perfectly manicured hand. Victoria Whitmore was, by most measures, a stunning woman. 60 years old, she looked 50. Her blonde hair, maintained by a colorist who charged $400 per visit, fell in perfect waves. Her face, refined by the subtle artistry of a renowned plastic surgeon, bore the immaculate appearance of someone for whom aging was treated as a personal failure to be surgically corrected. "Well," Victoria demanded, her voice carrying the particular sharpness of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "They gave away our reservation," Charles said, his words emerging like individual accusations. "Apparently, they had an unexpected cancellation that they seated another party in. They suggested that we could return next week." Victoria's face darkened in a way that had intimidated wait staff and service workers for the better part of 3 decades. "Did you tell them who you are?" Charles had indeed. The maitre d' had listened politely, expressed sympathy, and then explained that the restaurant's policy was firm. Reservations held only until 20 minutes past the reservation time. Charles and Victoria had arrived 23 minutes late. They'd been held up at a real estate closing, discussing properties worth millions of dollars, and in their minds, surely this justified their tardiness. The world, after all, had always bent to accommodate them. This small, unexpected resistance had shaken something fundamental in Charles's understanding of how the universe operated. The couple moved toward the elevator bank, both radiating the kind of anger that comes not from genuine hardship, but from the rare experience of not getting their way. They had money, power, and the kind of social connections that opened doors in Los Angeles. That a restaurant, had closed a door in their faces felt like an assault on their very identity. The elevator doors opened. Margaret Chen was exiting, her walker positioned in front of her in the doorway as she made her slow, careful transition from the enclosed space to the marble corridor. To Charles, she was an obstacle. To Victoria, she was an annoyance, a walking reminder of mortality and decline, everything both of them had spent substantial sums trying to avoid. "Seriously," Charles said, the word dripping with contempt. He didn't step aside. He didn't wait. He simply stood there, conveying through his posture and expression that Margaret should move faster, disappear, become less of an obstruction to his day. Margaret's shoulders flinched at the tone. She'd heard that particular sound, contempt dressed as impatience, many times before. During her nursing career, she'd witnessed it directed at elderly patients, at disabled individuals, at anyone the world deemed inconvenient. She'd always defended those people, had always insisted on their dignity. Now, that defense was directed at her. "I'm sorry," Margaret said immediately, her voice apologetic despite being the one who'd done nothing wrong. She tried to move her walker to the side, to compress herself into a smaller space, to occupy less room in the world. "Can't you move any faster?" Victoria asked, not truly expecting an answer. The question was rhetorical, designed purely to reinforce Margaret's inadequacy. Victoria had begun to move forward, preparing to simply push past this obstacle that dared to occupy space in her vicinity. In her nervousness, trying too hard to accommodate, Margaret's foot caught slightly on the edge of her walker. She stumbled forward fractionally, not falling yet, but losing her balance in that critical moment when the body betrays the will to remain upright. It was this moment, this split second of physical vulnerability, that Charles seized upon as justification for what he was about to do. "Move," he said, and as he spoke the word, he didn't ask or insist. He shoved Margaret's shoulder, a violent, deliberate push delivered by a man outweighing her by a considerable amount. Margaret lurched forward, gasping. Victoria, not to be outdone in their shared expression of disdain, kicked the walker sideways with the toe of her designer shoe. The aluminum frame clattered away from Margaret, leaving her without support, her body already off balance, her hands grasping for something that no longer existed. The marble floor approached with terrible inevitability. Time seemed to slow in the way it does during genuine trauma, each millisecond stretching into an eternity. Margaret's hands came forward instinctively to break her fall, a reflex born from her aging body's knowledge that impact at her age could mean broken bones, permanent injury, the final humiliating loss of independence. She crashed downward. Her hand struck the cold marble. Her knee hit next. Her right shoulder impacted the unforgiving stone with an audible crack that made nearby observers wince. For a moment there was silence, that stunned, shocked silence that follows violence in civilized spaces where people have been conditioned to believe such things don't happen. Then the moment shattered. A woman screamed. A man rushed forward. Phones emerged from pockets and purses as if summoned by some primal instinct to document, to witness, to create a permanent record of what had just occurred. Margaret lay on the marble floor, unable to push herself up, her body screaming in pain, her mind in a kind of shocked disbelief. The sophisticated shopping center, the gleaming marble, the designer storefronts, everything seemed to tilt around her. She was aware of Charles and Victoria standing nearby, and she was struck by a horrifying moment of clarity. They weren't rushing to help her. They weren't expressing concern. They were simply standing there, their faces registering annoyance at this complication, as if she'd fallen specifically to inconvenience them. A woman knelt beside her. "Don't move, honey, can you hear me? Don't move." Multiple voices overlapped, creating a cacophony of concern and outrage. "Did you see that?" He pushed her. "Call security. Call 911. I got it all on video. I got everything." A man's voice cut through the noise, older, authoritative, carrying the unmistakable tone of someone accustomed to command. "I'm a physician. Everyone back up. Give her space." But Margaret wasn't listening anymore. She was focused on the fact that her body had failed her in the most public way possible, and she was lying on the ground like a broken toy, visible and exposed and utterly, completely vulnerable to the world. Above her, the lights of Crescent Heights gleamed with cool indifference, illuminating a moment that would ripple outward and touch the lives of everyone present in ways none of them could yet foresee. Commander James Edward Mitchell pulled his restored 1967 Chevrolet Impala into the parking garage of Crescent Heights, his German Shepherd, Rex, sitting calmly in the passenger seat with the practiced composure of a military working dog. At 55 years old, James carried the bearing of someone who'd spent 32 years in the United States Navy, 17 of those years with the elite Navy SEAL teams. His hair, now more silver than black, was cut with military precision. His face bore the weathered appearance of a man who'd spent years in harsh climates, and his eyes, sharp, intelligent, constantly observing, missed nothing. The past 8 months had been the most difficult of James's life, though few would understand why. After 32 years of service, a helicopter crash during a training exercise had resulted in injuries that the Navy's medical board determined were incompatible with continued active duty. A herniated disc that pressed against nerves, chronic pain that medications could only partially manage, and the loss of the physical capability that had defined his entire adult existence. These were the invisible wounds that no medal could honor. The Navy had offered him a comfortable retirement package, and James had taken it, knowing he had no choice. But retirement, he discovered, was a particular kind of death for men like him. Without a mission, without a team, without the clear purpose that had organized his entire life, James found himself adrift in civilian existence, struggling to find meaning in a world that moved at a different speed, that valued different things, that no longer needed him. Rex had been his constant companion for 7 years. The German Shepherd had been trained as a military working dog, specializing in patrol, detection, and protection work. When James had retired, his commanding officer had arranged for Rex to retire with him, a rare privilege granted because of their exceptional bond, and because James had trained the dog from puppyhood. Rex was 10 years old now, his muzzle graying slightly, but his instincts remained sharp, and his loyalty to James was absolute. They understood each other in the way that only warriors could, with a completeness that required no words. James had driven to Crescent Heights specifically to escape the empty house, to find normalcy, to sit in a cafe and pretend that his body didn't ache, that he still had a purpose beyond simply existing. He'd brought Rex because the dog was an excellent therapy animal, and people responded to him in ways they didn't always respond to James. Humans made assumptions about men like him, the military bearing, the alert eyes, the way he seemed ready for conflict at any moment. But when they saw him with Rex, saw the gentleness with which he handled the dog, saw the obvious love between them, their defenses softened. James had parked the car and was preparing to leave the garage, Rex on a perfectly fitted service dog harness, when he heard the sound, not loud enough for most people to notice, but distinct enough for someone trained in tactical awareness to recognize it as trouble. The sound of impact, the sound of violent contact with the floor, the specific acoustic signature of a body hitting marble. His hand tightened on Rex's harness. His tactical awareness, honed through decades of military training, kicked into high gear. He moved with purpose toward the source of the sound, his mind already running scenarios, assessing potential threats, identifying possible courses of action. When he entered the shopping complex, he saw her immediately, Margaret Chen lying on the marble floor, her walker several feet away, her hands braced against the stone. A woman knelt beside her. A man in a suit stood nearby, talking into his phone. Scattered around them were witnesses, phones held up, some recording, some simply staring with the shocked expressions of people who just witnessed violence. James's eyes swept across the scene with the trained precision of someone who'd analyzed dozens of dangerous situations. His gaze landed on Charles and Victoria Whitmore standing motionless, and in the space of a heartbeat, he understood exactly what had happened. The lack of concern on their faces, the way they stood apart from Margaret rather than rushing to help, the subtle body language that screamed indifference and contempt. He'd seen men like Charles Whitmore before, wealthy men who believed the rules applied to other people, men who'd never faced consequences, never learned humility, never understood that civilization rested on the premise of basic human respect. "I'm coming through," James said clearly, his voice carrying the absolute authority of a man accustomed to having his commands obeyed. He moved forward with Rex, his bearing perfectly composed but radiating a kind of controlled intensity that made people instinctively step back. He knelt beside Margaret with surprising gentleness. "Where does it hurt?" he asked, his voice shifting into the calm, reassuring tone he'd learned to use with injured soldiers. "Can you move your toes? Can you feel your legs?" Margaret nodded, her eyes wide with shock and pain. "I'm Commander James Mitchell. I'm a retired Navy SEAL and I'm trained in first aid. You're going to be okay. What's your name?" "Margaret," she whispered. "Margaret Chen." "Margaret, I'm going to carefully check you for serious injuries. Just stay still." As James worked, Rex positioned himself directly beside Margaret, the dog's natural instincts recognizing that she was frightened and hurt. The German shepherd rested his large head gently near her hand, his warm body pressed against her side, a completely untrained but deeply intuitive act of comfort. Rex had spent years with James protecting vulnerable people, and his response to Margaret's distress was automatic and profound. It was this moment, James kneeling beside an injured woman while his war dog provided comfort, that Charles Whitmore finally seemed to register that something significant had changed. He looked at James, and James looked back. The exchange lasted only a moment, but it was laden with meaning. James's eyes were cold, assessing, and utterly certain of their own moral authority. "We should call 911, James said to no one in particular, though his words were clearly directed at the people who'd been standing uselessly nearby. "And security should be contacted immediately. There was an assault here, and I imagine there are several witnesses and possibly video documentation." Several people nodded. One woman said, "I have it all on my phone, the whole thing." James turned back to Margaret. "Can you tell me what happened?" Margaret's voice shook as she described the collision, the shove, the kick. As she spoke, James's expression remained professionally neutral, but his jaw tightened with the controlled fury of a man trained to process anger without letting it control his actions. "You did nothing wrong," James said firmly. "This wasn't an accident. This was assault and there are witnesses. You have legal recourse and I'm going to help you pursue it. I promise you that." Behind them, Charles Whitmore had gone pale. Victoria's perfectly composed expression had fractured into something closer to alarm. They'd never considered consequences. They'd never imagined that their actions would be witnessed by someone like this, someone with the authority, the training, and the evident determination to ensure accountability. For the first time in their lives, Charles and Victoria Whitmore experienced something unfamiliar, the genuine fear that their actions might actually have consequences. James remained with Margaret, his presence a steadying force, his authority absolute. Rex stayed pressed against her, and the two of them, the retired warrior and his faithful dog, became the physical embodiment of justice finally arriving. The paramedics arrived within 7 minutes of James's call, their professional efficiency filling the space with purpose and competence. Margaret was carefully loaded onto a gurney, her injuries assessed with practiced precision. A fractured right wrist, severe bruising across her left knee, contusions on her shoulder and palm. Nothing life-threatening, but enough damage to require hospital documentation and ongoing treatment. James rode with her in the ambulance, his steady presence becoming the anchor that kept Margaret from drowning in shock and pain. At Santa Monica Hospital, while Margaret underwent X-rays and received treatment, James began the work that came naturally to him, systematic, methodical documentation. He obtained the names and contact information of every witness he could identify. He created a detailed timeline of events. He photographed Margaret's injuries before they were treated, creating a visual record of the violence inflicted upon her. He obtained her medical records from the treatment process. He was, in essence, building the kind of investigative case he'd been trained to construct during his military career. By the time Margaret was discharged later that evening, James had already contacted his former law school roommate, Daniel Rodriguez, who'd gone on to become a prominent civil rights attorney in Los Angeles. Daniel had listened to the brief description of the case and immediately committed to taking it on pro bono. "This has everything," Daniel had said over the phone. "Clear assault, documented disability, multiple witnesses, video evidence. This is either going to result in a settlement that scares every wealthy person in this city, or it's going to result in significant jail time. Either way, we're going to make sure justice is served." What James and Daniel didn't yet know was that the story was already spreading far beyond the confines of Crescent Heights. One of the witnesses, a 32-year-old woman named Sarah Chen, no relation to Margaret, had recorded the entire assault on her iPhone. She'd captured the moment of impact, Charles's aggressive shove, Victoria's cold kick, and Margaret's fall to the marble floor. Within 2 hours of the incident, Sarah had posted the video to her Instagram account with the caption, "Just witnessed one of the most disgusting things I've ever seen. Wealthy couple violently assault disabled elderly woman at Crescent Heights Shopping Center. No remorse. No apology. This is who the rich really are. Disability rights justice for Margaret." Sarah's follower count was modest, around 4,000 people, mostly friends and acquaintances. But one of those followers was a journalist for a local Los Angeles news station. The journalist, recognizing the story's immediate newsworthiness, shared the video internally. By evening news time, clips of the assault were being broadcast on local television channels. By the following morning, the video had been shared across multiple social media platforms and had accumulated over 2 million views. The comments section became a digital outpouring of rage. "This is absolutely disgusting. These people should be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Rich people really think they can do whatever they want. Hope they get sued into oblivion. Has anyone identified these monsters yet?" It took less than 12 hours for someone to identify Charles and Victoria Whitmore by name. Within 24 hours, their photographs were circulating on social media, along with detailed information about their real estate development business, their property holdings, and their past. People began digging into their history, and troubling patterns emerged. A former household employee came forward on Reddit, describing years of verbal abuse and disrespect. A woman who'd worked as a server at a restaurant the Whitmores frequented shared a story about how Charles had publicly humiliated her for bringing the wrong wine. The comments multiplied, each new revelation adding another layer to the portrait of a couple whose cruelty extended far beyond a single moment at a shopping mall. News outlets began investigating. Local journalists made calls to the district attorney's office. Editorials appeared questioning how wealthy people seemed to operate under a different set of rules than ordinary citizens. By day 3, Charles Whitmore's real estate development firm had begun receiving cancellation notices from business partners. The Whitmores' names were being pulled from charitable boards they'd served on for years. The country club they'd been members of for 2 decades issued a statement indicating that the club's board was reviewing their membership in light of conduct unbecoming. It was on day 3 that the true scope of the security footage from Crescent Heights became apparent. The shopping center's security system had 12 cameras throughout the complex, and several of them had captured the incident from multiple angles. The footage was beyond question. Charles's deliberate shove, Victoria's kick, the moment of Margaret's fall, the look of indifference on their faces as she lay on the ground. The cameras also captured the moments afterward, the Whitmores not attempting to help, not expressing concern, not demonstrating the slightest indication of remorse. James obtained copies of this footage and personally delivered them to Daniel Rodriguez. Daniel, in turn, shared portions of it with selected news outlets, creating a carefully orchestrated media strategy designed to maintain pressure on law enforcement while protecting Margaret's privacy and dignity. On day 4, the Los Angeles Police Department announced that charges would be filed against Charles and Victoria Whitmore for aggravated assault. The district attorney's office released a statement indicating that the case represented a serious crime, a violent assault on a vulnerable victim, and that they intended to pursue it with appropriate force. Social media erupted in what people called a reckoning. The Whitmores' past became public narrative. Their children, including their adult son Michael and daughter Jennifer, were approached by reporters. Both declined to comment initially, though Jennifer later issued a brief statement indicating that she was deeply ashamed of her parents' actions. Michael went further, refusing to defend them and indicating that he was fully supporting the victim in seeking justice. Charles Whitmore's business partnerships began to dissolve. A major development project in downtown Los Angeles, a project that would have generated significant revenue for the Whitmore Development Company, was pulled by the principal investor, who cited reputational concerns. Meanwhile, Margaret was dealing with her own recovery, both physical and emotional. The bruises were healing, but the psychological trauma lingered. She had nightmares about the moment of impact, about the cold indifference on the Whitmores' faces. James visited her daily, bringing Rex with him, the dog's presence providing comfort that extended beyond words. On day 5, James arranged a meeting between Margaret and Daniel Rodriguez. The attorney explained the charges being filed, the potential outcomes, the civil litigation strategy that was being developed. He spoke carefully about the legal process, the testimony she might be required to give, the public nature of the case. "You should understand," Daniel said to Margaret, "that by moving forward with this, your case will become very public. Your name, your story, your medical history, these will all become part of the public record. Are you prepared for that?" Margaret sat in silence for a long moment, her damaged wrist resting in her lap. She thought about 5 years of invisibility, of being overlooked and dismissed, of the world treating her as less than human because of her disability and her age. "Yes," she said quietly, "I'm prepared. Maybe it's time people saw me." James placed his hand on her shoulder and Rex pressed his large head against her leg. In that moment, the three of them, the retired warrior, the injured woman, and the faithful dog, became something larger than themselves. They became the physical representation of justice finally beginning its slow, inexorable work. The truth had emerged. The machinery of accountability was beginning to turn, and Charles and Victoria Whitmore, for the first time in their privileged lives, were discovering that their wealth could not protect them from the consequences of their own cruelty. The call came at 6:47 in the morning on the 6th day after the assault. Charles Whitmore was still in bed, having consumed a bottle of expensive Bordeaux the previous evening in an attempt to find sleep. His phone vibrated insistently on the nightstand. He ignored it. It continued, relentlessly, forcing him to wake from the fitful doze he'd finally achieved. The number on the display was his business partner and co-founder of Whitmore Development Company, Kenneth Matthews. In 30 years of partnership, Kenneth had called Charles early in the morning only twice, both times for genuine emergencies. "We need to talk," Kenneth said without preamble, "in person, before the market opens." Charles met him at their office in downtown Los Angeles, a sleek glass and steel structure that had once been a point of pride. Now, as Charles rode the elevator to the 42nd floor, he noticed something different in how the security guard had looked at him. Not respect, not deference, something closer to revulsion. Kenneth was waiting in the conference room, his face carefully composed into something resembling professional neutrality. Beside him sat the company's corporate attorney, Susan Martinez. "We want you out," Kenneth said bluntly. "Effective immediately. You're a liability. The Cascade Development Project, worth $87 million, is off the table. The investor pulled out yesterday. He specifically cited concerns about the character and judgment of company leadership. That means you." Charles felt something in his chest constrict. "Kenneth, we can manage this. We'll issue a statement. We'll demonstrate that this was an isolated incident." "Isolated?" Susan interrupted. "Charles, you assaulted a disabled elderly woman in public. There are videos, multiple videos. The district attorney is pursuing felony charges. Every major news outlet in Los Angeles has covered this story. You're not managing this. You're drowning in it and you're pulling the company down with you." Over the next hours, the dominoes began to fall with increasing speed. The Redmond Plaza Development Project, 42% complete, worth $120 million, was suspended by the municipal government pending an assessment of the development partner's ethical standards. The Beacon Hill Residential Complex Project, which was set to break ground in 3 weeks, had its permits suspended by the city council. The city attorney's office issued a statement indicating that they could not in good conscience move forward with projects involving parties currently facing criminal charges for violent conduct. By noon, Charles had been forced out of Whitmore Development Company. Kenneth bought out his share at a fraction of its normal value, using the depressed valuation as punishment and pragmatism. Charles walked away from the company he'd spent 30 years building with approximately $8 million, a fortune by most measures, but a fraction of what his ownership stake should have been worth. But the financial hemorrhaging had only begun. The civil lawsuit filed by Margaret Chen's attorneys was seeking $15 million in damages, medical costs, pain and suffering, lost wages, and punitive damages designed to ensure that the assault would be expensive enough to deter others. The Whitmore's insurance company immediately began distancing itself from the case, reviewing whether their policy actually covered intentional assault. The answer, they determined, was no. The Whitmores would be personally liable for any settlement or judgment. By day 10, Charles Whitmore's personal wealth had been decimated by legal fees. His attorney, one of Los Angeles' most prominent criminal defense lawyers, was billing at $850 per hour. The civil litigation attorney was billing at $1,200 per hour. Between the two firms, Charles was spending approximately $35,000 per day in legal fees. Meanwhile, Victoria had her own crisis unfolding. She'd been a member of the Riviera Country Club for 23 years. The club's bylaws allowed for membership revocation in cases of conduct that brings disrepute to the club. Her membership was terminated after a special board meeting. She received a formal letter on embossed stationery, informing her that her membership fee would not be refunded. The country club had been Victoria's primary social universe. It was where she'd had lunch with her friends 3 days a week, where she'd played tennis, where she'd attended galas and charity events. Without it, her social calendar suddenly looked devastatingly empty. Her closest friend, Patricia Stanford, a woman with whom she'd spent countless hours, had stopped returning her calls. When Victoria finally reached her through Patricia's husband's office, Patricia's message was clear and devastating. "Victoria, I'm sorry, but I can't be associated with you right now. People are asking me questions. They're making assumptions about my character based on my friendship with you. I need to put some distance between us." Similar conversations happened with 6 other women Victoria had considered close friends. One by one, they withdrew. The bridge club she'd hosted monthly was quietly disbanded. The charity committee she'd chaired for 8 years replaced her with someone else. Her children, Michael and Jennifer, had been forced to make choices. Michael, who worked in entertainment law, found his client list shrinking as various producers and studios decided they didn't want to be associated with the Whitmore name. His firm suggested he take a leave of absence until the publicity died down. Effectively, they'd fired him without using the word. Jennifer, who worked in public relations, the irony of which was not lost on anyone, had been let go by her firm 3 days after the assault. Her boss had been sympathetic but clear. "We can't have you working here. Our clients are asking for assurances that your family's behavior won't reflect on our company. For everyone's sake, it's best if you move on." Both children issued separate statements to the media indicating they were appalled by their parents' actions and were cooperating fully with law enforcement and the civil process. Neither took their parents' calls. Jennifer hired her own attorney specifically to protect herself from any connection to her parents' liability. Charles and Victoria's marriage, which had survived 36 years through the kind of empty distance that wealth and separate lives made easy, began to fracture under the pressure of genuine crisis. "This is your fault," Victoria said one evening, her voice cold and accusatory. "You pushed her. You made the physical contact. I was just—" "Just what?" Charles snarled. "Innocent. You kicked her walker, Victoria. You kicked an elderly disabled woman. There's video documentation." They began sleeping in separate bedrooms. Victoria considered hearing her own attorney separate from Charles's, essentially positioning herself to throw her husband under the bus in hopes of minimizing her own culpability. The house, Their beautiful mansion in the Hollywood Hills, worth $8.4 million, was increasingly under threat. The legal judgments and settlements they were facing would likely exceed their liquid assets. They were going to have to sell it. The thought consumed Victoria more than the guilt of her actions ever could. By week 3, the psychological toll was evident in both of them. Charles had lost 15 pounds, his face gaunt and gray. Victoria had begun experiencing panic attacks, her body's response to the loss of status and security that had organized her entire adult life. On day 21, Charles received notice that his membership in the Los Angeles Country Club had been voluntarily terminated per his own written request, except he'd never requested it. They'd simply expelled him and given him the option of pretending it was voluntary. The empire that Charles and Victoria had spent decades building, an empire constructed of money, power, social position, and the casual cruelty that wealth enabled, was collapsing around them with accelerating speed. What they were discovering was something no amount of money could protect them from: the simultaneous withdrawal of every social and professional prop that had held their lives aloft. They were alone, increasingly broke, and facing the very real possibility of prison time. The irony, bitter and complete, was that for the first time in their lives, Charles and Victoria Whitmore were experiencing something approximating what a significant portion of the human population experienced regularly: the consequences of their own actions. Margaret Chen sat in the makeup chair at the Los Angeles Times studio, watching as a professional applied foundation and highlighting to her face. 6 weeks had passed since her assault, and she'd been asked to appear on California Today, a morning talk show with significant reach throughout the state. The makeup artist, a kind woman named Rosa, was being exceptionally gentle around the still fatting bruises on Margaret's face. "You're going to do great," Rosa said softly. "My grandmother is disabled too. Thank you for speaking up." Margaret felt tears prickling at her eyes, which would have been a disaster for the makeup application. She took a breath and steadied herself. Over the past month and a half, she'd been surprised by how many people approached her with similar stories of invisibility, of disrespect, of being treated as inconveniences by a society that hadn't been designed for their bodies or their limitations. The interview lasted 45 minutes and was far more substantive than Margaret had expected. The host, a woman named Patricia Morrison, asked thoughtful questions about what it felt like to be assaulted, about living with disability in a world that seemed determined to ignore disabled people, about the moment Margaret's life changed forever. "I want to be clear about something," Margaret said, her voice steady and clear. "I'm not special because I survived being attacked. Millions of disabled people navigate hostile environments every single day. What happened to me was shocking because it was caught on camera and happened to someone in public. But the disrespect, the dismissal, the assumption that disabled people are inconveniences, that's constant. That's the water we swim in." The segment aired the following morning and was immediately shared across social media. By noon, it had accumulated over 3 million views. The comments section was divided between people expressing support for Margaret and people defending the Whitmores, but the narrative had shifted. Margaret was no longer just a victim, she was becoming a voice. Over the next 3 weeks, Margaret was invited to speak at disability rights organizations, at universities, at schools. She accepted every invitation that her healing body could accommodate. She spoke about the invisibility of disability, about the ways that society's architecture, both physical and social, excluded disabled people, about the importance of seeing people rather than dismissing them. She spoke at Loyola Marymount University to an auditorium of 400 students. She spoke at a high school in Compton, where she told teenagers that their treatment of elderly and disabled people would define their character far more than their grades or their social status. She spoke at a community center in Boyle Heights to a room full of elderly Latina women who recognized in her story echoes of their own experiences. After each event, people approached her with tears in their eyes. An elderly man told her that her speech had convinced him to finally leave his house again after 5 years of isolation following a stroke. A young woman with cerebral palsy said that seeing Margaret's dignity had helped her accept her own disabled identity. A teacher said that she'd changed how she taught her students about respect and inclusion. It was James who suggested the foundation. They were sitting on Margaret's back porch, watching Rex chase a tennis ball across the small yard. Margaret's wrist had healed, her bruises had faded, but the emotional recovery was ongoing. James had become a constant in her life, not in a romantic way, but in a way that was arguably deeper. He understood trauma. He understood recovery. He understood the need to convert pain into purpose. "You should do something with this," he said. "With the settlement money, with the platform you've built. Create something that lasts beyond the legal case, beyond your own story." Margaret considered this. The civil settlement with the Whitmores had been finalized at $12.8 million, a number so large that it felt abstract, unreal. She'd been living on her nurse's pension for 5 years, and the settlement represented more wealth than she'd ever imagined having. After taxes and legal fees, she'd have approximately $8 million remaining. "What would a foundation even do?" she asked. "What do you wish had existed when you were navigating your disability?" James asked. "What would have made your life easier, more dignified?" Margaret thought about the lack of accessible parking, the restaurants with inaccessible bathrooms, the stores with narrow aisles that couldn't accommodate walkers or wheelchairs. She thought about the healthcare workers who talked to her daughter instead of to her, as if disability somehow made her unable to understand her own medical situation. She thought about the way the world seemed designed to make disabled people feel unwelcome, burdensome in the way. "Accessibility," she said finally. "Real accessibility. Not the bare minimum that the law requires, but actual inclusion. Accessible buildings, accessible information, accessible transportation. And education, teaching people to see disabled people as full human beings rather than as problems to be solved." 3 months later, the Walking Forward Foundation was officially established with Margaret as executive director. The foundation's mission was straightforward: to fund accessibility initiatives in California communities, to provide grants for disability advocacy organizations, and to create educational programs teaching children about disability inclusion and respect. The first major project was a comprehensive accessibility audit and renovation of 5 public libraries throughout Los Angeles County. The second was the Speaking Truth program, which brought disabled speakers into schools to talk directly with students about their lives and experiences. The third was a grant program that provided funding for community organizations working on disability rights issues. Margaret worked with a dedicated staff of 8 people, most of them disabled themselves, many of them having experienced the kind of invisibility and disrespect that Margaret sought to address. Her office was in a beautifully accessible building, with wide doors, accessible parking, and bathrooms that could accommodate various disabilities. It was the kind of space that made disabled people feel genuinely welcome. Within the first year, the Walking Forward Foundation had distributed over $2 million in grants and had directly impacted the lives of thousands of disabled people throughout California. Margaret was invited to speak at the United Nations about disability rights. She appeared on national news programs. She was profiled in the New York Times and the Washington Post. She received invitations from universities to serve on boards and advisory committees. But despite the attention and the recognition, Margaret remained grounded in a kind of humility. She always credited James with pushing her toward this work. She always emphasized that she was simply one voice among many disabled people who deserved to be heard. She was careful never to position herself as a savior or a spokesperson for disability, but rather as one person sharing her story in hopes that it might open hearts and minds. She visited schools where she spoke not from a stage, but from eye level with students, sitting on the same level as the children so they could see her as a person, not as a symbol. She answered their questions with honesty. When a child asked her if being disabled made her sad, she said, "Sometimes it does. Mostly, I'm sad about how people react to disability rather than about the disability itself." On the 1-year anniversary of the assault, Margaret held a community event called Dignity Day. Hundreds of people attended: disabled people, disability advocates, educators, community leaders. There were speakers, performances, accessible activities. At the center of it all stood Margaret, James, and Rex, the unlikely trinity that had changed everything. James stood beside Margaret, his arm around her shoulders in the way of two warriors who'd fought beside each other. Rex rested his head contentedly against Margaret's leg, and Margaret looked out at the crowd, seeing herself reflected in their faces. The elderly, the young, the disabled, and the able-bodied, all gathered in a space that had been explicitly designed to welcome and include every single person. "I didn't ask to become a symbol," Margaret said to the crowd, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered group. "I didn't want this to happen to me, but if my pain can become a bridge to greater understanding, then perhaps there's meaning in what happened to me. Perhaps something beautiful can emerge from something terrible." The crowd erupted in applause, and Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, not the pain of trauma, but the warmth of purpose finally, fully realized. The Los Angeles County Courthouse on Grand Avenue was an imposing structure of concrete and columns, a temple to justice that had never before paid any particular attention to Charles and Victoria Whitmore. But now, as they walked through metal detectors alongside their attorneys, they understood that they'd finally been absorbed into a system that didn't care about their money or their status. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. The security footage was played repeatedly: Charles's deliberate shove, Victoria's kick, Margaret's helpless fall. Medical expert testimony detailed Margaret's injuries and their lasting impact on her mobility and quality of life. Margaret herself took the stand, her composed testimony more powerful than any dramatic emotion could have been. She described the moment of impact, the pain, the humiliation of lying on the floor while people she'd never met came to her aid. But the most damaging testimony came from unexpected sources. The Whitmore's own household staff was called as witnesses. A woman who'd been their housekeeper for 14 years described years of verbal abuse, of being treated as invisible, of being scolded for minor infractions. A groundskeeper testified about being screamed at for trimming bushes in a way Charles deemed unsatisfactory. A personal chef described preparing meals for guests while Charles commented loudly that the food looked pedestrian and beneath their standards while the chef stood in the kitchen. Their children testified reluctantly. Michael, Charles and Victoria's oldest child, took the stand and cried as he described witnessing his parents' cruelty to service workers throughout his childhood. Jennifer, their daughter, delivered emotional testimony about the shame she felt being the daughter of people who'd assaulted a disabled woman and felt no remorse. "I can't defend them," Jennifer said, her voice breaking. "I've spent my entire adult life trying to be different from them, trying to prove that their values weren't my values. What they did to that woman is exactly the kind of thing I watched them do to countless other people. It was only shocking because the world was finally watching." The defense mounted by Charles's attorney was desperate and unconvincing. He argued that the shove had been unintentional, a moment of frustration that had escalated without premeditation. He argued that Victoria's kick was a separate action by a separate person. He painted Margaret as a sympathetic figure, but tried to minimize the severity of her injuries. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. Charles Whitmore was convicted of aggravated assault with a special allegation for committing the offense against a particularly vulnerable victim. Victoria Whitmore was convicted of assault and battery and also aggravated assault. The sentencing hearing came 4 weeks later. Judge Patricia Hernandez sat on the bench, her expression reflecting neither sympathy nor anger, just the cold assessment of someone tasked with determining proportional consequences. The prosecution argued for significant prison time. Victoria's attorney had requested probation, but the judge wasn't inclined toward leniency. "Mr. Whitmore," Judge Hernandez said, her voice carrying through the courtroom, "you committed an act of violence against a vulnerable woman. You showed no remorse. You have a history of mistreating people you considered beneath your station. You believed that your wealth and status insulated you from the consequences of your actions. You were wrong. 18 months in federal prison." Charles's face went pale. His attorney placed a hand on his shoulder as if to steady him. Mrs. Whitmore, you participated actively in this assault. While your sentence is slightly lighter than your husband's, the court cannot ignore your culpability. 12 months in federal prison, plus 18 months probation, plus 500 hours of community service to be served at a disability services organization. Victoria made a sound that might have been a sob or a protest. Her attorney immediately filed notice of appeal, but everyone in the courtroom understood that the conviction would stand. Charles reported to federal prison camp Safford in Arizona 3 months later. It was a minimum security facility, chosen, he suspected, because the judge wanted to avoid him being placed in a more dangerous environment. But minimum security didn't mean comfortable. Charles was placed in a dormitory with 11 other inmates. His cellmate was a 58-year-old man named Raymond who'd committed tax fraud. They shared 12 feet by 12 feet of space. The other inmates knew who Charles was. His case had been national news. Several inmates had elderly parents, disabled family members. His assault on Margaret had resonated with real people who'd experienced the kind of dismissal and disrespect Charles represented. He wasn't physically attacked, but he was isolated. Meals were taken at a table by himself. The television room emptied when he entered. Other inmates made comments loud enough for him to hear, about wealthy people who thought they could do anything, about men who hit women, about rich people finally facing consequences. The humiliation was constant and inescapable. Charles was assigned to work in the prison kitchen, a job that paid 12 cents per hour. He worked 10-hour shifts, washing dishes, preparing food, taking orders from a 22-year-old guard who addressed him as Whitmore with no honorific, treating him with the dismissive indifference Charles had once shown to people like Margaret. The kitchen supervisor was a woman who'd been imprisoned for embezzlement and had no patience for his complaints about the difficult work. "You think this is hard," she said one afternoon. "You assaulted an elderly disabled woman. You're lucky you're alive." He lost 30 pounds over the first 4 months, not from deprivation. The food was adequate if unpleasant, but from stress and the loss of the comfortable routines that had organized his life. His hair grayed further. His face became gaunt. He was aging years in months. Victoria's experience was perhaps even worse because she never adjusted. She reported to Federal Prison Camp Dublin, a women's facility in Northern California. Her cellmate was a woman named Torres who'd been imprisoned for drug trafficking. Torres recognized Victoria immediately and had little sympathy for her circumstances. Victoria's background in charity work didn't translate into prison volunteer positions. She was assigned to grounds maintenance. Essentially, she spent 8 hours a day picking up trash and maintaining landscaping. Her hands, which had never done physical labor, developed calluses and blisters. The sun, which she'd spent her life avoiding, burned her fair skin. She was required to participate in anger management and violence reduction programs, therapy groups where other inmates, many of them victims of abuse themselves, confronted her with the reality of her actions. "You kicked a woman's walker out from under her," one woman said during a group session. "Do you understand what that means? Do you understand that she could have died, that you permanently disabled her further, and you're crying about your hands hurting from picking up trash?" Victoria began experiencing severe panic attacks. The prison medical staff prescribed antidepressants. She lost weight rapidly, dropping from 130 pounds to 98 pounds over 6 months. She cut her hair short, no longer caring about appearance in a place where appearance meant nothing. Neither Charles nor Victoria received visitors. Michael and Jennifer had made it clear that they wanted no contact. Their few remaining friends had moved on. The people they'd considered close relationships revealed themselves to have been entirely transactional. Their mansion was foreclosed upon and sold at auction. The proceeds barely covered the legal fees and the settlement with Margaret. By the time both Charles and Victoria had completed their sentences, they were no longer wealthy people who'd experienced temporary setback. They were broke. Charles was released after 18 months. He emerged into a world where his name was synonymous with shame. No corporation would hire him. He eventually took a job at a warehouse, earning $15 per hour, working in the heat and the physical demanding conditions that his body, never hardened by actual labor, found nearly unbearable. Victoria, released after 1 year plus probation, attempted to find work. No one wanted to hire her. She eventually found employment at a retail store, where she worked for minimum wage, serving customers, taking orders from people 30 years younger than her, experiencing daily the kind of disrespect she'd once inflicted on others. The cruelest consequence was that neither of them could escape the knowledge of what they'd done. They couldn't travel to Europe to wait out the scandal. They couldn't move to another city where their name meant nothing, because by then, internet searches and social media ensured that their names would forever be linked to their crime. Charles and Victoria Whitmore didn't just lose their money and their status. They lost the illusion that insulated them from reality, the belief that they were different, better, exempt from the rules that governed ordinary people. And they discovered that the loss of that illusion was perhaps the most painful consequence of all. 18 months after her release from federal prison, Victoria Whitmore sat in a coffee shop in Santa Monica, her hands trembling as she waited for Margaret Chen. She'd practiced this moment 1,000 times, in prison, during anger management sessions, during the long nights when she worked retail shifts for minimum wage and had time to think about the person she'd become and the person she needed to be. The letter had come through James Mitchell, who'd agreed to act as an intermediary. "Margaret is willing to meet you," he'd written, "but you need to understand that this is not an opportunity for absolution. This is not a moment for you to feel better about yourself. This is Margaret's gift to you, a chance to speak your truth and to hear hers. Treat this with the respect it deserves." Victoria had cried when she received the letter. Not the self-pitying tears of her earlier imprisonment, but tears of genuine recognition of the enormity of what she'd done and the undeserved grace that Margaret was extending. Margaret arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, moving steadily with her walker, her bearing dignified and calm. She wore simple clothes, jeans and a blue shirt, nothing like the designer wardrobe Victoria remembered. She looked healthier than Victoria had expected, more whole somehow, despite the physical limitations that the assault had exacerbated. "Hello, Victoria," Margaret said, settling into the chair across from her with the careful precision of someone still managing chronic pain. Victoria opened her mouth and found no words. The practiced speech she'd memorized, the apology she'd rehearsed, suddenly felt inadequate, hollow, insufficient. "I don't expect you to say anything perfect," Margaret said gently. "There is no perfect apology for what you did. There's just the attempt to acknowledge harm and the commitment to do better." Victoria began to speak, and the words came from a place deeper than the carefully prepared script. She talked about the woman she'd been, empty, privileged, cruel, without ever acknowledging her cruelty. She talked about the moment in prison when she realized that the person she'd spent her entire life trying to be, beautiful, powerful, above the rules, was a person worth despising. "I thought I was unhappy because I didn't have enough," Victoria said, her voice breaking. "But I was unhappy because I was a terrible person, and deep down I knew it. I covered it up with money and status, but I knew it." She talked about attending anger management and violence reduction programs, and finally understanding the impact of violence on victims. She talked about the elderly woman in her cell block, a former teacher, who'd helped her see that every person she'd been dismissive toward had an entire inner life, hopes, dreams, dignity that had nothing to do with her assessment of their worth. "I kicked your walker," Victoria said, the words harsh and raw. "I kicked it out from under you. I did that deliberately. I don't know if I can ever forgive myself for that moment." "You may not," Margaret said simply, "and that's appropriate. Some things don't deserve to be forgiven, but I can forgive you, not because what you did was okay, it wasn't, but because holding on to anger at you would poison my own life, and I've chosen not to let your cruelty destroy me twice." They talked for 2 hours. Margaret told Victoria about the foundation, about the work she was doing, about the thousands of disabled people whose lives had been improved by the accessibility initiatives funded with money that essentially came from Victoria's cruelty. There was a strange symmetry to it. Victoria's violence had created the conditions for Margaret to build something beautiful. "I want to help," Victoria said finally. "I don't know what I can offer. I'm nobody now. I have no money, no status, but I want to help." Margaret considered this carefully. "There's a disability services center not far from where you live. They're always looking for volunteers. If you work there genuinely with respect for the disabled people you serve, then yes, you can help. Not to make yourself feel better, to contribute something of value." 3 months later, Victoria began volunteering at the Los Angeles Disability Services Center. She started in the most basic role, helping with administrative tasks, answering phones, cleaning the facility. Her supervisor, a woman named Angela who'd been paralyzed in a car accident, didn't extend her any special consideration. "I don't care about your past," Angela said during Victoria's first day. "I care about whether you show up, do the work, and treat disabled people with genuine respect. Can you do that?" "Yes," Victoria said, "I can." And she did. Over the course of a year, Victoria became an integral part of the center. She worked with disabled people one-on-one, helping them navigate social services, attending medical appointments with them, listening to their stories without judgment. She discovered that she had a talent for connecting with people one-on-one, for seeing them as individuals rather than as categories or problems. The transformation wasn't complete. Victoria still struggled with the losses she'd endured, still felt the sting of humiliation, still carried guilt about her past. But she began to understand that these feelings were appropriate, that they served as a constant reminder to be better, to do better, to see other people as fully human. Meanwhile, James and Margaret launched their ambitious mentorship program, Warriors and Witnesses. The program paired veterans, like James, many of them struggling with physical injuries, PTSD, and the loss of purpose that military discharge created, with at-risk youth from disadvantaged backgrounds. The program was brilliant in its simplicity. Veterans would mentor youth, teaching them discipline, resilience, and the importance of service to others. In return, the youth would help the veterans recognize that they still had value, that their experiences still mattered, that there were people who needed what they had to offer. James served as the program's director, drawing on his military connections to recruit veteran mentors and his credibility within the community to recruit at-risk youth. Margaret served as the heart of the program, connecting both mentors and mentees to the broader mission of building a more compassionate society. The program's impact was immediate and measurable. Youth participants showed improved school attendance and grades. They were less likely to engage in risky behaviors. More importantly, they developed relationships with mentors who saw their potential and believed in their futures. Veterans in the program experienced renewed sense of purpose. Several found employment because their mentoring work demonstrated that despite their physical limitations, they still had valuable contributions to make. Others simply found community, a group of people who understood what they'd been through and could support them through the transition to civilian life. 1 year after the program's inception, a grand Dignity Day celebration was held in a beautifully accessible park in downtown Los Angeles. Thousands of people attended, disabled people, veterans, youth, educators, community leaders, and ordinary citizens who'd been moved by the story. Margaret stood at a podium, with James beside her and Rex at her feet. Victoria stood several rows back, no longer seeking attention or recognition, simply grateful to be in a space where her presence was tolerated and her contributions were acknowledged. "I didn't ask for this," Margaret said, her voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "I didn't want to be assaulted. I didn't want to experience the pain and trauma of that moment. But I've learned that we don't always get to choose what happens to us. We only get to choose what we do with what happens to us." She paused, looking out at the crowd. 2 years ago, I was invisible. The world had decided I was inconvenient, that I didn't matter. One moment changed everything, not because my assault was unique, but because people decided to pay attention. And in that attention, something beautiful emerged. She talked about the thousands of people whose lives had been improved by accessible buildings, by transportation programs, by educational initiatives. She talked about the warriors who'd found purpose and the youth who'd found hope. She talked about Victoria, who she didn't name but whose transformation she acknowledged as proof that even people who do terrible things can become better. Justice, Margaret said, isn't just about punishment. It's about accountability, yes, but it's also about creating the conditions for genuine change. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the person who hurt you can become part of the solution. As the sun set over the park, the crowd stood together. Disabled people and able-bodied, rich and poor, victims and perpetrators and witnesses, united in the recognition that human dignity was not a luxury, but a fundamental right that society had an obligation to protect and celebrate. The assault that had once seemed like an ending became, instead, the beginning of something transformative. And in that transformation lay the possibility that even the darkest moments could illuminate the path toward a more compassionate world.